All right. Well, here we go, guys. How you doing? My name is Jason. I am the Partner Program Consulting and Training Manager. I need a whole webinar just for my name, I think, my title. I just want to welcome you all here. We're so excited for this opportunity with all of you. And got a chance to meet you, most of you, either on a phone call or in your centers. And over the last 8 months or so, we've had these conversations, and we know that conversations are getting more challenging. And so we're excited to have Dr. James Aaron Brown with us tonight, and just to talk a little bit about how maybe we can equip everybody better as they go into those counseling rooms. Couple things I want to a couple quick housekeeping things. One, please keep your microphone muted throughout the duration of the call or the webinar. We cannot hear you, but everyone else can. So that could just be embarrassing for you. It also helped us with a better recording, so appreciate that. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So as we go through and as we're chatting, if you have questions, feel free to write those down and pay attention to them, because we may answer them as we go through. And but when we get to the end, we're leaving plenty of time, I think, for us to answer questions. So if you have them, Megan is going to be monitoring the chat. So put any questions that you have in the chat, and she will let us know when we get to that point that we are ready for those questions. Dr. James Aaron Brown. I know him as Aaron, so we're just going to go Aaron, if that's all right with you. You guys all saw, and I will say it again, is a speaker and consultant in the area of Gen Z or organizational dynamics. He leads the Institute for Generational Dynamics, which helps organizations be more productive in the face of generational conflict. Serves as an assistant professor of business and finance, and has written for The Federalist, The Stream, and The American Thinker. Aaron, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah. So I wonder if we could just start. If you could tell us a little bit about what got you kind of fired up about this stuff, and why now this is what you do.
Yeah. So it was probably summer of 2018. I was completing my doctorate at Regent University. By completing, I was starting my doctoral dissertation. And so I was going to work with a historic nonprofit that was relaunching. I was going to work on their organizational structure, strategy, dynamics, all of those things moving forward. And then suddenly I was not. And all of a sudden I didn't have a dissertation anymore. And so there was a nonprofit that I was working for in the worldview space. And I approached them and said, hey, we want to do something in line with organizational dynamics, even innovation, bringing innovation to an existing platform. Are there any opportunities here? And they said, oh my gosh, we totally have something. We want to take our experience and make it smaller and get it into more states. So that sounds fantastic. And I can do a doctoral dissertation on this. So I go back to my chair. I was like, hey, this is what happened with the other opportunity. And they totally understood. They understood how these things happen. But I haven't come empty-handed with no ideas. I've done the work to get this opportunity. And can I do my dissertation on innovating this product, this worldview product? Absolutely. 6 to 8 weeks later, I was laid off. And so I was left. Do I go back to my chair? What do I do? And I decided, no, it's time to ride this poem. Got to get a dissertation done. I need to be a doctor instead of not being a doctor. And so I started pursuing it. As I pursued it, Gen Z was really the heart of what I started pursuing around this idea of worldview and where Gen Z is at. And it just started opening up a world that I was relatively unaware of. Like, I understood the worldview space, I understood culture and all of those things. But Gen Z was a demographic that I didn't pay really any attention to.
Sure.
And so as I continued to develop the idea, I ended up hosting kind of a workshop here in Colorado Springs, had 150 attendees for that workshop. And eventually people were like, I need more, I want more. And over the last 2 years, I've had the privilege of speaking at human resources conferences. My favorite one that I like to brag about is I got to speak at the SEC conference on Gen Z. So University of Alabama invited me to speak. And so it's not just a topic, but it's a group of people that I continue to grow passionate about and love these situations where I get to come and share about Gen Z.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. I know that, for me, not only working with all of these drafters, my kids are Gen Z.
Right.
So it's kind of cool for me to be trying to help the pregnancy centers better, but selfishly, can you help me be a better dad? So
I think you just saw the fear in my eyes when you said that.
Cool. Well, all right. Well, let's dive in here to some of this stuff. A lot of people will say that Gen Z is the most activist generation and a generation that will change the world. Can we talk about what your thoughts on the Gen Z generation?
Yeah. So the way I want to begin to answer that question is, I think Gen Z is a very creative generation. I think that they are a disciplined generation to some degree, more disciplined. And we'll get into that more. Why I think they're disciplined. I think they're more focused in some ways as well as frugal. And typically, maybe we don't think of frugality as a virtue. I think Gen Z is a very frugal generation. The last item that I want to list is when I look at Gen Z, it's the most diverse generation that we have had in America. So approximately 1 out of every 2 Gen Z are not college. And I think that as we move forward in America, having a generation that reflects heaven in America is going to be profound for how it shapes our culture and where we're headed, and understanding each other and celebrating culture and things like that. So that's one thing that I really like to hang out with, is I think that because they're so diverse, the sky is the limit of where we can go.
Yeah, I love that comment about looking more like heaven.
Yes.
That really struck me. Talk about maybe a little bit about how they like to do volunteering.
Sure. So I want to begin with some positives before we hit the volunteerism. And thank you for bringing me back to the question. The reality is that there are very skewed not demographics, but statistics out there about volunteerism. Okay. We've got a huge problem. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of COVID, but that really, it spells the way that it sounds pretty much. It really threw all of our statistics off. So 2017, 2019 was really the last time we had good statistics pre-pandemic. Yeah. So post-pandemic statistics aren't good right now. It's really difficult to get a handle on where any generation is at with different, whatever you want to analyze. It's difficult to get a handle on that. So pre-pandemic, volunteerism among Gen Z-aged individuals decreased by almost a whole percentage point. So when people make the claim that Gen Z is the most activist generation, I don't think the data is there to support it. Now, in America, especially in the 90s, early 2000s, there was this idea that if you're a high schooler and you want to get into a good college, then you've got to do all of these things. You've got to volunteer, you've got to take AP classes, and so on and so forth. Well, we've continued that narrative in America. When I use the word narrative, it's a story that we buy into. We continue that narrative in America when in actuality, Gen Z is a generation that spends on average 10 minutes less with each of these activities. So they're spending about 8 minutes less on schoolwork. They're not working jobs. So when I was a kid, I worked at McDonald's when I was in high school. They're not working at McDonald's. On top of that, the activism, it's not clear what they're active or volunteering about. I mean, you see people bring up statistics of, well, they're the most active volunteerism-driven generation. Well, active and volunteering, yeah. But that's something that's never clearly laid out. Now, there's good information out there that says Gen Z is the most giving generation. And on average, they give about $25 to a cause that they identify with.
Wow.
So, there's this, I'm a big believer in the idea that you vote with your dollars.
Yeah.
Whatever you buy, that's what you support. And Gen Z is really a big proponent of that. We'll parse that out as we work through the evening. But it's really not clear. Traditionally, the most active demographic of volunteerism is usually between the ages of 35 to 54. Only a quarter of volunteers are male. It's about 75% are female. And some of that volunteerism comes from parents who have decided to return to church, and they put their kids in a great children's ministry, and they probably feel a little bit of guilt of, I should probably volunteer at least one Sunday a month to make up the gap. And there's good information out there that supports that viewpoint. So I think there's a lot of great things going on with Gen Z. I'm not convinced they're the most activist generation. I think probably where some things land is they probably use their social media to champion causes. And I think that is viewed as activism. Not good.
So I want to ask kind of off of that conversation, specifically with the social media. And we know now about Meta and like this whole drive really to push everything digital.
Yes.
Do you think that maybe that's why they're focusing on making social media activism?
I think. Are you asking me? Is like Meta trying to push for activism?
Maybe what I'm asking is activism moving?
I think we've seen that activism, and depending on what camp you're in, is very powerful via social media. So go to all of your popular news blogs, whether it be Breitbart or Huffington Post, and you will see, even the Daily Wire. I used to really enjoy it. I have nothing against it, but now it's like this person tweeted. I don't care what that person tweeted. But the reality is that we now have a culture that does care what people are tweeting. So I think that what we are seeing is that social media is a really great tool for canceling people.
Okay.
So as people wield that power, they're going to want to use things like Meta or Twitter or TikTok hasn't emerged yet as a cancel type culture as far as I'm aware of. But it is one of the more powerful social media platforms out there, especially among this demographic.
Sure.
So let's talk a little bit, because this is one thing I think that is always a concern for people as we look at younger generations.
Sure.
Is like, are they voting?
Yeah, that's a great question. So traditionally, young people don't vote. And so this is in 2020, this was considered the triumph of Gen Z and millennials in their 20s. And it was, wow, this is the biggest voter turnout we've ever had for a presidential election among 18 to 29-year-olds. Well, yes, but let's hold our breath for a little bit.
Sure.
Because our culture was essentially having a referendum on where we were headed as a country. And however way, the demographic of 18 to 29 was mobilized to vote and voted the most that percentage-wise that they'd ever voted. But let's pause for a second and say, will that happen in the fall of this year when we have House of Representatives and
Right.
senator seats open up? There's plenty of buzz that while the administration and the House and the Senate are all controlled by one party, which was something we saw similarly just a few years ago. There's not a lot of movement, a lot of promises that we were told would be tackled, especially things like student loan debt.
Yeah.
Those things have not been addressed the way that the people who voted hoped they would be addressed. So let's wait and see. Let's wait and see what happens in 2022. Let's wait and see what happens in 2024 when this demographic has the opportunity to vote again. My guess is we'll see the voting percentage decline this year and in 2024 compared to what we saw in 2020.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see, I think, for sure. And I think you're right. Like, I'm very curious to see. Gen Z does seem to pay attention.
They are,
and they're watching promises not being fulfilled.
Yes.
And it'd be interesting to see. I think. Do you think it might be more telling whether or not they vote or who they vote for? In other words, are they going to be a generation that goes, "Okay, I voted for these guys. They didn't do what I wanted, so I'm just not going to vote."
It's so interesting that you say that. Here's what I think. In the work that I've done and the research that I've done, I think Gen Z will slowly pull itself out of the cultural purview. I think that they will decline in voting. I think that it won't be important to them. I think that they will see it as, well, I voted. Why didn't all of this stuff get changed? Now, we have to keep in mind that before the previous presidency came along, nobody had seen a president do so much.
Sure.
I mean, not since the 1950s. And I mean, I wasn't around for that. So
I was not either.
I'm just, reporting what I've read.
Yeah.
But we hadn't seen that before. And so that was the glimmer of hope for this referendum. It was like, if that administration can do it, then this administration can do it. And that just hasn't been the case.
Yeah.
And I like to speak academically and sometimes dispassionately to say I'm not making a value claim on any of this, because though parties go every which way and they do some things you really like and they do some things you really don't like. So I don't want to make a value claim around anything. But generations like Gen Z typically are not the culture shapers of the American experience.
Interesting. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the way we were kind of planning to go, but I'd really like to know, one of the things that, actually, I don't want to skip ahead. How is Gen Z spending their time? I want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, Gen Z, if you are a teenager, so let's get a few details out in the open for everybody out there. So right now, Gen Z is between the ages of 8 and 26.
Okay.
I place Gen Z's birth year at 1996. Really well known
in this field of millennials and Gen Z that I really look up to. Her name is Jean Twenge. She places Gen Z at 1996. You'll see others like, I think Barna and Key probably placed them later, like 97, 99, something like that. I think 96 is a good year. And what we have to keep into account is there's not these magical cutoff points for generations, but there are moments in history that shape a generation. So for Gen Z, what shapes them is...
So the iPhone suddenly gives people access to social media away from their desktop, away from their laptop. They're now carrying it around in their hands 24/7. So that's 2005. Facebook is just developing around that time, but eventually all you need is an email address. You don't need a college email address. You just need an email address.
Sure.
And this opens up access even more. And then on top of it, you've got Twitter emerging, other platforms, but you also have the 2008 financial crisis.
Right.
And that has a profound impact on Gen Zers growing up with Gen X parents. And so these forces shape a generation. So people often will say, well, it's got to be the 2001 9/11.
Yeah.
It has to be 9/11. I'm like, no. 9/11 shaped me as a millennial.
Yeah.
Because I was at a point, I was 17, 18 when I saw the planes fly into the Twin Towers. That has a profound impact on me. Not a profound impact on a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old. Like, yeah, maybe they have vague memories of watching it over and over on TV, but it's not a profound impact. So these forces shape who a generation becomes, and you just kind of, there's an art and a science to it, moving around those key events to figure out when does this generation begin and end. But your question was,
what do they do?
What do they
do?
do? How are they spending their time? So they're spending their time on things like social media, and typically they spend their time with about 5 screens at once, which is insane. So TV, phone, some type of tablet, computer, and then, there's something else thrown into the mix, but on average, 3 to 5 devices at once. And so Gen Z, as they early shaped, was a generation that didn't really leave the house that much. It was a generation that was at home with their devices, communicating with friends on some type of, Twitter or Instagram or something like that. There's a bunch of platforms we could just say, but that's how they were learning to communicate. So it also means that you have a generation that was not learning nonverbals the way that many of us learn nonverbals growing up, because we didn't have something to look at or preoccupy ourselves. And so communication is a challenge among some Gen Zers.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up, because something that we're going off script. I'm sorry. Something that you and I talked about last time we talked was about them growing up slower.
Yes.
And I know that it took me a minute to kind of grasp onto what you were talking about. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So Gen Z is a generation, and Jean Twenge, I think, coined this term. She said they are a generation that is growing up more slowly.
Okay.
So as far as emotional maturation, it's a slower progression. And typically these things begin with a generation like millennials. And then for a generation that follows millennials like Gen Z, the obstacle tends to grow with that generation. So when it comes to emotional maturity, Gen Z is just a generation that grows up a little bit slower. So for instance, television shows. I can't believe I just said television. Who even watches that? Maybe streaming shows. I don't know. But shows that maybe a 13 or 14-year-old would watch. With Gen Z, we found 16, 17-year-olds watching that show. And that hit home for me. I was working for a university in the Midwest. I was a residential life director. And I was talking to these students, and these students were on the cusp of millennial Gen Z. And I'm talking to these students, and they're talking about watching a show on the Disney Channel. And I was just sitting there thinking, you're 18, 19 years old. What are you doing making Disney Channel references? Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. But the reality is that they're just growing up more slowly and spending more time with more adolescent type material, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is something that I, as a younger Gen Xer, would have watched at 13, 14 years old. They're watching at 16, 18 years old.
Yeah.
And so
they're not growing out of it at the same pace you and I would have grown out of something.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. And I think that actually plays a little bit into even these conversations that our directors are having with these people. Yeah. Because we see an physical age, and there's certainly a presumed emotional maturity level for that physical age.
Absolutely.
And so now to understand a little bit that it's not quite exactly the way that we're used to is, I think that's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you told me that they're more interested in mentorship. Can we start to explore that a little bit? Because that when I was reading through this, I thought, man, that's really cool.
Yeah. So, and I think going through a pandemic has really exposed this. So, some folks out there may be familiar with the term that is going through the news waves, especially if you watch like a Yahoo Finance or something like that. It's called the Great Resignation.
Okay.
And what this term basically means is that we are at a point in our economy where the most talented among us are able to say, I don't really want to go back to the office. I've had my fun and games working from home. I didn't have to do that awful 30, 45-minute commute. I got to get work done faster and more focused, and I got to spend more time with my family. Why in the world do I want to go back to a desk job?
That's fair.
So, and I just interviewed for the university that I work for. I just interviewed somebody last week, and we discussed this topic of we've also learned that company culture is still just as toxic as it was 10 years, 20 years ago. A lot hasn't changed, actually. And so people are like, why do I want to put up with this? Like, I'm very talented. I can write my own ticket. Well, with Gen Z, they were just entering the workforce as the pandemic hit. The first Gen Zers graduated in 2014, 15, 16, 17 from college. And so they were entering the workforce and starting to get their feel around that. And they wanted to experience this new social environment with coworkers and people older than them. And they wanted and still want to be mentored by millennials and Gen Xers, and they're even open to baby boomers mentoring them. And the problem is that we have Gen Xers and baby boomers who are convinced that Gen Zers don't want anything to do with them. And that's just not the case. And to tie all of this together, a lot of the reason for this is that with millennials, we coined the term helicopter parent. With Gen Z, we coined the term snowplow parent. So many Gen Zers grew up not with parents who kind of hovered around and watched, they grew up with parents who were like, I'm going to make the path of success as smooth as possible for my Gen Z child. Now, where that is noble, this idea like we want the best for our children and to give them opportunities that we didn't have, it creates a problem. And that problem is the metaphor of the caterpillar in the cocoon. And some of you are saying, Dr. Brown, we know that caterpillars don't live in cocoons, they live in chrysalises. Thank you for correcting me. So the caterpillar and the chrysalis. And so if I was walking by a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis and I saw it struggling, this is my butterfly struggling face, and it's struggling and it's like wiggling, it's trying to get out. And I said, you know what? I'm going to help this little guy out. Pull out my pocket knife, make a tiny little snip or insertion to open up that chrysalis just a little bit. I feel good about myself. I've done my civic duty for the day. I've helped a butterfly not struggle as much. The reality is that I've doomed that butterfly. That butterfly needed the pressure of escaping that cocoon in order to strengthen its wings for it to fly away. And what we have is a generation where the cocoon got open too much for them with a pocket knife. And they deal with these issues of anxiety around, do I have what it takes to succeed on my own? And I think to some degree, it even creates a disjointment from reality. So if you look at studies that have been done over the last 20 years, Gen Z has the highest rates of anxiety compared to any previous generation. Now, people will say, and there's probably some merit to this, but people will say, well, I think people are just speaking up and speaking out again, not against, but about mental health issues now.
Yeah.
Now, that's good. I agree with it. I am somebody that, I tell people when I give these talks, like this hits home to me because in my late 20s, I discovered that I had a genetic disorder for anxiety and had no idea. Went through my life from age 5 to my late 20s and discovered it in counseling that was dealing with this. So I like to speak as openly when appropriate about what I have experienced working through this. But I think what we have to take into account is how Gen Z is expressing their mental health challenges and what they're expressing it around, and how they're coping with that. I think these are different than previous generations.
So how is mentorship different than making it easier for them to come out of their cocoon?
Yeah. So what we have found is that Gen Z is carrying this anxiety of, do I have what it takes into the workplace? It's actually what I did closed up my dissertation with, was how do companies onboard the most anxious, stressed out generation in the workforce? And so the conclusions that I came to, and I have other generations. I remember I did an interview for a podcast about this, and I think the interviewer was so outraged over what I'm about to say that they never did the podcast. They recorded it, chose not to air it. I think that's what happened.
So you're saying we're on the verge of being done with the webinar?
I think so.
Okay. Well,
it wasn't the microphone issue. It's what I'm about to say. It's going to send everybody just like, no. What we have to understand about Gen Z is that because they are not sure that they have what it takes to succeed, they desire constant feedback. And I wouldn't say affirmation. I think affirmation is a little bit of a stretch, but they want constant feedback to know if they are performing well, performing correctly. And so that's where this desire for mentorship comes along, in that mom and dad did all of this stuff for me. So I'm used to being told, I'm used to things being taken care of.
Yeah.
So that plays into it. And I think that's why we see that Gen Z is also the generation most inclined towards socialism, this idea that a big parent can take care of everything. Yeah. So I think that's part of those inclinations. And so what I need is an adult, or I want an adult to continue to give me feedback and tell me that I'm doing things right or wrong. Now, this is where that podcast went a little south, because the person interviewing me said, so you mean I've got to hold their hand the whole time? Like, I mean, it was very emotional and heated like that. And I have a few responses to that. And my first response is, well, you raised them. You
Fair
raised them.
Yeah.
And you can't be too upset that you did exactly what you intended to do, in the sense of, I want to make the path smooth and help my kid out and give them an advantage that I didn't have.
Yeah.
You did that. Now, the unintended consequences of that is my kid's more anxious than any previous generation and not sure that they can handle life on their own. So I think that's where the desire for mentorship comes in, is I'd really like an adult to continue to tell me if I'm succeeding or not succeeding.
But a mentor, in a different way than a parent.
Sure.
A mentor's desire is for you to eventually be able to do that thing on your own.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
So I would think what I think I'm hearing you say, especially with mentorship, is if you think about helping a baby learn to walk.
Sure.
Like, yeah, you're going to hold their hand for a few steps.
Yes.
But at some point, you're going to have to let go of that hand.
Exactly.
And they're going to have to fall, and you're there to pick them back up.
Yep.
And so what I hear you saying is that this is a generation that's looking for somebody to help walk with them, and that will be there with them when they fall, to help pick them back up.
Yes.
And get stronger as they continue to move forward.
And I think it's a very simple tactic of a mentor saying, I'm not going to hold your hand when you do this next thing in the workplace. And maybe you'll fall down, maybe you won't, but we'll talk about it after it happens. And it's not going to be the end of the world which way it happens. So I think that, like, to your point, mentors want their students to grow beyond them. And I think just having that plan around what does success look like, and saying it's all going to be okay. It's not going to be the end of the world. So,
yeah. And I think, it's interesting that even thought, because I think that's what all the pregnancy centers that I talk to, I think probably everybody that's watching right now, like, that's what they desire, is to walk these women through a difficult time where maybe they are actively stumbling.
Absolutely.
Be able to pick them up and then eventually be able to release them, you know, and maybe they turn around and become mentors, right?
That's
like,
the dream, right?
It's kind of like, I heard this term once. It's pretty old. I think it's called discipleship. Does that sound okay? So
I've been in church 40 years. I don't know what you're talking about. So,
so I think one thing that I want to kind of step into a little bit here is, because we're stepping into this space of what does Gen Z want for them to be able to succeed? Sure. You know, how do they want us to help them succeed? And I think it's important for us to understand, and I think we all do, but it's not enough to just understand that the target has moved.
Right.
But rather, where is it moving to, and how can we meet them where they're at?
Absolutely. That's
so
good.
One of the things that I think really has been a challenge for pregnancy centers that they've met very successfully
Mhm.
is living circumstances.
Sure.
Right. So I want to abort because I don't have the money or I don't have, good stability, job concerns, fear of judgment, and fear or the reality of a lack of support.
Mhm.
What do we know about Gen Z that might help us address those things?
Yeah.
And I think mentorship might be a part of that,
Sure.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So as I was stumbling upon this when I was working on my dissertation and everything, and my world was upside down, I was privileged to have a conversation with Dr. Cho, who's the vice president of innovation and discipleship at IntraVarsity.
Okay.
So I emailed him one day and I was like, hey, I'm working on my dissertation. I saw that you did some work similar with millennials. Do you have 15 minutes? Which was a lie in the sense of, was I really only going to take 15 minutes? No, I was going to take all the time I could. But you got to bait people. So I was like, hey, can I have 15 minutes? And he was like, yeah, sure. Like I got an email back and I was like surprised. I'm like, this is awesome. So I think we ended up talking for an hour or something like that. He's like, yeah, I thought when you said 15 minutes, this would go much longer. And I was like, well, but he used a lot of the same ideas that I used for Gen Z, but he used them for millennials. And so he came up with a driving question.
Okay.
And the driving question is something that explains the ethos of a generation. When I use the word ethos, what I mean is, how does this explain the culture and the attitude and the ideas and the dreams of a generation? And so his question was, he teed it up this way: all millennials ask, what is beautiful? All millennials ask, what is beautiful? And that becomes the driving force around everything that they do. I remember being in college and almost every undergrad, almost every fellow millennial talked about working for a nonprofit. But they wanted to change the world. Now, I'm not saying that you don't change the world as a nonprofit or anything like that. What I am saying is the idea was the best way for me to change the world is through the medium of a nonprofit or ministry, full-time ministry or something like that. What we realize now is that there are so many ways to change the world through all of our occupations and vocation. That's another conversation. But millennials are always asking this question, well, how do I make things beautiful? How do I make the world better? Gen Z asks a much different question. And what I arrived at as the question, every Gen Zer asks, am I safe?
That fits well into that anxiety equation, right?
Exactly. And so what we see in the workplace, kind of going back to the workplace and where I think feeds directly into your question, is that what are the three things that Gen Zers say they want in the workplace? Well, the top one is healthcare. That's number one. I want healthcare. Okay. Am I safe? I want a good salary. Okay. If you come out of post 2008 financial crisis, money's an issue. You grew up with Gen Xer parents. I think Gen Xers are the toughest generation out there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Gen Xers survived, if they went through the 70s, they survived with their parents, like uber high inflation that, we're just now getting tastes of in modern day. Oil crisis, Iran-Contra, Black Monday, 1987, Wall Street, where everything crashed, 2001 recession, 2008 financial crisis. Like Gen Z gets sucker punched like every 5 or 6 years, maybe 7 or 8. But Gen Z is growing up with parents who they're seeing this happen to. And on top of it, their parents are teaching them, like, be frugal, do this, do that. Why? So it's a feeding out of that Gen X ethos of I've been hit over and over and over. So you really got to have your ducks in a row when these things happen. So we see that with Gen Z. And then the last thing, the third thing is a mentor. I really want a mentor in the workplace, and I want to socialize and meet people and have friends. And so I was reading an article the other day. Gen Z goes to work and they're working remotely. And it's like, I've been on my screen my entire life.
Yeah.
And so when will this ever change? When will I ever, get different? And so with Gen Z, they're asking this question of, am I safe? And so that's such a huge question that our pregnancy resource centers have to start looking through the lens of. So when I did my workshop on Gen Z, I called it Lenses, the story of Gen Z. So just like you and I are wearing glasses tonight, glasses are meant to, they're meant to bring things into focus and to help you see. And so I think that the question of, am I safe? If you can make that the lens of your glasses and start seeing almost every action and activity through that question of, am I safe? I think you start to be able to answer questions. So, I've given this talk a lot, and invariably, within a few weeks or, maybe a month or two, I'll start getting emails like, oh my gosh, Dr. Brown, I see it. I totally see it. And I don't think it's like, tricking people into, thinking that it's all there. But once they start asking the question and they start interpreting how Gen Zers respond to things, they're like, I see the term is safetyism. I see all the safetyism now. So, if you've got a young, it doesn't even matter if they're young, but, if you've got a woman who is, there's a term that I want to use, that are at risk for abortion.
Sure.
Is it abortion vulnerable?
Vulnerable, that's a good term.
So vulnerable. If you have somebody that's vulnerable and they're Gen Z, they're really asking the question, am I safe? What is safe? Go ahead.
What's fascinating about that is that one of the conversations that I have regularly with center directors, because look, we're all believers.
Sure.
We believe in Jesus.
Yep.
We believe that Jesus is what is going to fix all of these problems, right?
Absolutely.
But we often talk about when is the right time to share the gospel.
Oh, sure.
And if you have had an unsafe experience in a church,
oh, sure,
and you're walking into a pregnancy, one of the things that we're doing here at Storix through our church engagement is kind of coming to terms with some really difficult things.
Yeah.
For instance, 30% of the women sitting in the pews at churches are likely post-abortive.
Yes.
40% of women walking into abortion clinics are regular attenders at church. They're going more than once a month.
Yeah.
So, and we've heard anecdotally and from people like Natasha, who does a lot of talking to these people, that I would rather go to God with an abortion than my pastor with an unintended pregnancy.
Wow.
And am I safe? It clicks right in there, doesn't it?
It clicks right in there.
Am I safe going to a pastor with an unintended pregnancy, or that fear of judgment piece, right?
Yeah. And I've got a friend, she asked the question, she's like, and I know this sounds stereotypical, I'm just repeating the question that she asked me.
Sure.
So
I'm not going to judge you. I don't know about the other people.
Right. She said, Aaron, as a woman, I tend to ask the question, am I safe? Like, are the doors locked? I'm in this sketchy parking lot, things like that. How does that fit with your question about a generation of, am I safe? And I was like, and this is where I get nervous and start to sweat, and I'm just waiting for the hand to come over and like pat my head. That is a natural, ubiquitous response from a gender.
Okay.
Now, not everybody, like I'm not trying to stereotype. I'm saying
Sure.
in general, that is something that the feminine gender, female gender, they experience. Men, we tend to not think like, am I safe in this parking lot? What's you're like? I'm just going in my car. Who are all these people around me?
Let's be real.
Okay.
The reason for that is we're not as smart.
And that's part of it, but I didn't want them to know that, Jason.
I am a man in a woman's world. I have to acknowledge every one of these executive directors that I meet with have heard me say, I don't know why they put a guy who cannot multitask on the phone with women who can all the time. And Megan's probably getting a yes that he said that to me 6 times.
It's all those
in the chat right
emojis that look like claps or like hand raises or high fives and everything.
So, but I think there is a truth to, and silly or not, we just don't think that far ahead sometimes.
No.
And women are thinking, I think, a lot farther ahead.
Yes.
And I mean that in a very positive way.
And they think about specific things around safety. This question of am I safe encompasses most things.
Yeah.
And so we even see language that has developed of somebody asked me a difficult question and I didn't feel safe. Before Gen Z, we didn't really have these questions.
Well, and I want to go after that.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go after it kind of hard.
I mean, I can leave if I want to.
No. What I mean is, I have had this response.
Sure.
To, it's just a question.
Yes, for sure.
Like, can we, honestly, there have been times where I'm like, can we just grow up? It's just a question.
Sure.
But the reality is, and this is why we're doing this, is that we can be frustrated with
all you want
that,
to
be. But it doesn't change them and where they're at.
Not at all.
But if we can acknowledge, okay, that's where you are. I may think it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But that's where the target is. Yeah. And that's the target that I have to hit. Yeah. Then can we easier meet them where they're at, even if it's not where we typically would be?
Sure. And I think if we were to take what you just said and ask the question, is there something like this found in the Bible? I sure think there is. And I think it's in Acts, and I think it is when Paul is at Mars Hill and he's hanging out in the Agora and he's got Stoics and Epicureans and these other philosophers and sophists. And they're all debating each other and they have all these different ideas and everything. And Paul communicates the gospel to them in a way that would catch their attention. He doesn't change the gospel. He doesn't water it down. In fact, we find at the very end when he brings up this idea of the resurrection of the dead, that was when they were like, whoa, I was with you right until that. Because in Greek society, nobody rose from the dead. Nobody. And so that was the final nail in the coffin in Paul's discourse. But to your point, Paul said, instead of me just going like full out Jewish and explaining who Jesus is, I'm going to go full on Greek and explain who Jesus is. And I think that we have to do that with any generation that we're working with. So it's those of us who are younger, maybe we're like baby boomers. Man, I just don't understand. Okay, well, let's be Paul at Mars Hill. Let's get curious.
Let's have a conversation.
Let's have a conversation. Let's get curious and understand why you see the world the way that you do. And it's the reverse with Gen Z. We have the opportunity to be explorers, to be curious, and to really sit down and get to know Gen Z. I mean, anything that I would encourage people to do is find a Gen Zer, their ages 8 to 26, and sit down and say, I don't understand anything about you. Would you help me understand something about you? And just start the conversation that way.
Yeah. Well, so the next thing I want to talk about, and this, I mean, maybe we just kind of talked about it a little bit, but let's reinforce it. So I got two stories.
Okay.
Two stories from me having conversations with some of you, me visiting some of you, and then a comment that was on the survey that I sent out. So story out of New Jersey.
Okay.
Client boarded
New Jersey's the first, like,
Hey, I'm going back there here in a few weeks. So client boards one of our stork buses, and she's there to get an ultrasound to find out the gender of the baby that she's having.
Yeah.
Only because she wants to know so she can go back to the father and tell him, this is the gender of the baby that I aborted. So
Oh my God.
we can go New Jersey and go, well, New England is crazy pants, right? But my next story is out of Tennessee,
Sure.
in small town Tennessee. And a girl walks into one of our partner centers and she says, look, I really kind of want to have this baby, but I want him gone more than I want to have this baby.
Sure. Yeah.
And in both of those situations, those relationships, not the baby, were the thing that were really the thing that mattered. Right.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, that I got, the responses I got from the survey that we had, there was a comment that said that showing the value of the unborn through ultrasound or offering post-choice services like material assistance classes, providing supportive community doesn't seem to matter to younger clients. It seems like Gen Z doesn't value being a mother at all, ever. And instead of it being bad timing, now it seems the babies are just bad. So what I want to try to figure out how we can do is how do we flip that and say, like, there's positivity in these conversations and maybe not necessarily in those situations, but are those good tools for us to figure out what direction we need to start heading?
Yeah. So I want to say something hopeful, and then we'll, work our way through those things, and then I'll say something hopeful. What we are currently seeing, I think, because the political climate swung so far hard left during the previous administration with abortion rights, what we're actually seeing are millennials and Gen Z saying, I really think we need to dial this back on abortion. So pulling, back, I don't know if the heartbeat bill would definitely fall in that range, but somewhere, 2 months, something like that. And then a lot are saying, I don't think abortion should be legalized unless it's, the typical rape, incest, things like that. So I think there's a shift in the culture of millennials and Gen Zers that we didn't expect.
Okay.
Especially with a generation that grew up with normalized abortion. It's always been this way. It's a right.
So what I think I hear you saying is that some millennials and Gen Z are going, hey, I think we jumped the shark a little bit.
We're too far. We're too far out there.
I'm not sure if he got that or if Megan got that, but some of you on the call got the jump the shark reference. I guarantee it.
I didn't get jump the shark, to be honest with you.
It's a very Happy Days reference. So,
I watched that a long time ago in reruns, which you did as well. You watched it in reruns.
I did. Yeah. I'm not quite. Well, anyway. Okay. So, please continue. Sorry.
Didn't mean to pull the blanket off of you. So I think there are some attitudes that are shifting in our culture that, wow, we didn't expect this to happen. Now, with what you said, like, I want to have the baby, dad's in the picture, or even like using ultrasounds. My guess is, I'm not saying this is, I'd have to do a study on it, but my guess is that ultrasounds are seen on a screen, and what is real about a screen to a Gen Zer? So, interfacing with electronic devices all of the time, and even the push of Meta and stuff like that. Why would seeing something on a screen?
So there's a disassociation between reality and the screen.
I think that's quite possible.
Okay.
I think that's quite possible. Now, again, I'd want to do...
I'm living on a screen, but I also recognize that most of that is fake.
Right.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. I mean, we think about how people really call out fake in social media.
Sure.
Is everything okay?
guys can
Okay.
kind of blew my mind a little.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So here's what I think. You've got a generation that is hungry for personal connection.
Yeah.
That's what we're seeing. Now, we're also seeing, you alluded to this a little while ago, like we also have the least church generation. I lead our 20s, 30s ministry at New Life Midtown here in Colorado Springs. And one thing that we talk about often is the recent Barna research in the last 2 or 3 years that a committed Christian is now defined as someone who goes to church 1.3 times a month, 1.7 times a month.
Wow.
And I'm not slamming Barna. That's not my intent with it, but we have scaled back the definition of commitment to once a month. And, you made the joke about discipleship earlier. Yeah. We would say, how does discipleship take place?
Yeah, we're
for
lowering
1 hour in
right.
30 days.
Yeah.
Bible reading is, it is what it is. It's way down. It doesn't matter what generation you're at. Bible reading is down. But to your point, or to your question, we have a generation that is hungry for connectivity. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a great opportunity for pregnancy resource centers to partner with the local church. I am a huge fan of the local church.
Yeah, I don't think they're going to disagree with you on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe the local church is the hope of the community. And we have, I don't know if we would classify a PRC as a parachurch organization, but it feels pretty parachurch to me.
Yeah, in some ways, sure.
And so I think there's a great opportunity to find people who say, I would love to invest in someone who is abortion vulnerable. I would love to come alongside them and answer any questions that they might have about life. I'm not a big fan of the word mentor. I think it became too much over the last 20 or 30 years that we've used it. But I would just love to be a guide for somebody. Now, my church, we are an intergenerational church. And one thing that I have learned is that being somebody's discipler is not a great gig.
Sure.
But being somebody's friend and walking with them through their coming to Christ and their transformation in Christ, that's really fun.
Yeah.
That's really fun. And what I've also learned is that if it's all on me to mentor or disciple this person, I'm probably feeding my ego more than I'm feeding my friend. And what I have learned is we want to be as intergenerational as possible. So there's an individual that comes to mind, started coming to our church about 1.5 years ago. And he jokes around that I'm his sponsor. He's like, he'll call me. He's like, well, Aaron, you're my sponsor. So, yeah, you're my sponsor. And I was like, okay. And so, I'll listen to the things that he's struggling to. And he called me one day and he was like, are you mad at me? I go, no, why would I be mad at you? He's like, because you know what I did. And I was like, okay. Yeah, I know what you did, but it doesn't change the fact that we're friends and that we're in relationship. And I can see that the Holy Spirit is working and moving in your life. And you can't see it like I can see it. But I can see from the first day you showed up at our church and asked for me, and I can see that transformative process over the last 1.5 years. You can't, but I can. And I believe that the work that the Holy Spirit has started in your life is going to continue. And, we probably do like a once a week pep talk. It's almost like a coaching session. It's great. But what I also do is, hey, you need to go find Mike. Mike's 50. leads one of our table groups. Like, you need to go find Mike, and you need to make sure that you're meeting with Mike once a month. And here's another guy you need to meet with, and another guy. And so what ends up happening is that the way that we kind of do this thing is the church is full of fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. And so a whole family gets to have input into somebody who has come to Christ instead of just one person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if PRCs are able to take this idea and develop something around it of, well, instead of just having like a mentor, what if we have a tribe of mentors? Now, some people may, hear that reference from the entrepreneur guy. He wrote a book. I don't know why I'm blanking out on his name right now.
I don't know.
He's down in Austin. Gosh, Timothy Ferriss.
Okay.
So he wrote a book a few years ago called Tribe of Mentors, and it was just a thick book of best advice from the people that he had ever encountered. Mm-hmm. Well, what if we have like living, breathing tribe of mentors where we can say, hey, Rick and Susan. I don't know why Rick and Susan are like the happily married couple that's been in the church for 20 years, but hey, Rick and Susan, can you make sure that our friend who's abortion vulnerable comes over to your house for dinner once a month? Like, we think that she's going to make the choice to have her baby and raise her baby. And we just know that she needs someone like you in her life to walk with her, guide her. Now, she knows that you can't do everything, but she knows that you're going to be there for them. And don't worry, we've also got Steve and Marcia. Now, Marcia, that's a name you don't hear anymore. Steve and Marcia, and they're going to help out too. And then eventually, you've got this tribe of mentors, this family now that's helping walk this person. And anecdotally, most stories that I hear, we live in a society where men are afraid to say that, no, I actually do want my child. They've been taught that this is only the mother's decision, and that they should stay out of it and be perfectly accommodating. But men also need to speak up and say, no, I want my child. Yeah. And I think that this is a great opportunity for families to say, hey, you don't have to get married. Maybe this isn't the guy that you want to marry and live under one roof with, but let's bring this tribe of mentors around both of you, and you get to make the decision if you keep showing up or not. Yeah. And we've got a no judgment policy here. They're just going to give you advice and guide you and leave it at that. So
and I think I love that, and I love how that fits in even with what we're trying to do here at Storks with our church engagement stuff.
I'm excited about that. First time I heard about it, I was like, this is awesome.
Yeah. So, if anybody out there is interested in that, we'd love to get Joseph connected with you and see if there are ways that we can help you guys connect with your churches. But there's this little bundle of TNT that has been lit for a while.
Sure.
And I can almost hear the Texas centers, if any of them are on this call, waiting for me to throw it in the middle of this. Okay. So
I think I know what you're talking about.
There are two things.
Yeah.
We have the Texas Heartbeat Act.
Yeah.
And we have the abortion pill.
Sure.
So what we've heard a lot from some of these Texas centers is they used to have the time to go and find some mentors and do this thing.
For sure.
But now I've got to come in, I've got to have my ultrasound, I've got to make sure there's no heartbeat, and then I've got to order that pill.
Yeah.
So while long-term, we want to see those mentorships and those things develop.
Sure.
Short-term, how do we impact Gen Z in those types of situations?
Yeah. I think we have to keep in mind that I want to say something, and everybody's laptop is going to explode after I say it, but I need you to stick with me and let me explain myself as I am unpacking this. Gen Z is on a search for truth. Now, that doesn't necessarily look the way that it sounds like I'm saying.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is, I think there is a key to how Gen Z consumes information. Now, we have to remember Gen Z is the first internet native generation. You and I, so I grew up in a town of 700 people. We had rotary dial phone. We were relieved to get away from party lines. And some people were like, oh my gosh, I know what he's talking about. And so like, I remember doing this as a kid and the whole dial spinning and everything. When internet came out, there was AOL, and it sounded like, when you turned it on, it sounded like dubstep. And people were like, what's dubstep? I don't understand. It's electronic music. And so.
Or Prodigy.
Yeah.
Dial-up.
So we grew up like through the painful years
Right.
of internet development. Gen Z didn't. They grew up native to it, and they have grown up inundated by information. They know how to find things.
Right.
And so, and on top of they know how to find things, they also consume according to their identity.
Mhm.
So what I mean by that, a few months ago, I was in a coffee shop here in the Springs, and I see this young guy, and he's wearing this hat that says "Sad Boy." And I was like, looking at the hat, and I'm one of those people, inquiring minds want to know. And so I was like, what does your hat mean? And he looks at me and says, the hat is face value. I'm like, what does that, like, I wanted to actually just like drag, I'm a big guy, so I could like drag him over the counter and be like, I need you to explain this to me. But what I began to understand was he was sad that day and wore a product that he bought that reflected his emotional state. So Gen Z also consumes brands. One of the biggest areas that Gen Z consumes is brands associated with mental health. So if it's like a positive, it doesn't even have to be positive. It just has to acknowledge that mental health is the obstacle in this. And so whether you're sad, happy, there's a product called Mad Happy. It's like whether you're mad or you're happy, like this product reflects, where you're at with your mental health, things like that. So Gen Z wants to consume what is real. Maybe that's a better word than true, but what they perceive to be real and genuine. Gen Z has made strides where you and I, if we saw something like Tiger Woods, and if we were really into golf and we saw Tiger Woods wearing a Tag Heuer watch, we'd be like, maybe I want a Tag Heuer watch. Tiger Woods is at least wearing it. Like, we don't really question, does he wear it the rest of the time?
Sure.
Gen Z wants to know, are you a paid personality? Do you get paid for, and they use the term influencer. So are you paid for this? It's fine if you are. I just want to know, are you paid for this? And then they want to know, like, does what the product promise really deliver?
Mhm.
And so I think that what I would throw out to PRCs is, how can you get the correct information in front of someone who is vulnerable and say, listen, we believe and know this is the truth about your situation. Now, you can walk across the street to the other guys or, whoever, and we've got some questions that we want to give you that you should ask them so that you can get the full picture of what you're about to purchase. I'm trying to use
Sure.
lingo that connects. So I think that one, we have to have that information ready and available, and the hard questions ready and available. And I think we also have to say, you can't, like, nobody's stopping you from going and talking to the other group, but we think you should ask these questions.
Mhm.
And if you have any questions about the questions that they answer, come back to us. We'd love to continue talking to you about it.
Yeah. So
Go ahead.
So what I think I'm hearing you say is that what we want to try to really do is be super authentic and real with the information that we have. say, and what's interesting kind of about this conversation too is, I think we think about sharing the gospel
Sure.
with an unbeliever.
Sure.
Oftentimes I think we feel like we need to plant the seed
Uh-huh.
and fertilize it
Mhm.
and water it
Sure.
and watch it
Yeah.
and sun it and make sure that it grows
Yeah.
and then clip off the dead things. And but we have to do all of that,
Right.
where Jesus tells this parable
Yeah.
about the sower and the seed,
Yeah.
and we throw the seed and let it fall
Sure.
and let God trust that God is going to do the other pieces.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so in a similar situation, maybe the responsibility is give them the facts and trust that God knows
Yes.
what's going to happen. If they walk across to Planned Parenthood or an abortion clinic
Sure.
or whatever it is, I love the idea of, we think these are the questions you should ask them. And if you're concerned about their answers to these questions, we would love to talk with
We'd
you
love to
about
talk.
that.
Because
And-
that's honest, right?
Right. But because at the end of the day, and look, I'm going to say this directly to you guys. It's not our guilt if they make the wrong choice, and it's not our glory if they make the right one.
Hmm.
And that can be something that can free us,
Yeah.
and just that authenticity to be willing to say, look, recognize, acknowledge for
Yep.
them, this is your decision to make. And if you want to go talk to them,
Mhm.
we think you should ask these questions.
Yep.
And if you don't like their answers, we would love for you to
Yeah.
come back and talk to us.
Or if you have questions about their answers, come back.
Right. Yeah.
And at the end of the day, that's probably all we should do. I mean, we were having the conversation before we started recording about growing up in the 90s and the early 2000s and families that turned their children away because of whether you want to call it a lifestyle choice or whatever it might, however
Sure.
you want to term it. How well did that work?
It didn't.
It didn't.
Yeah.
And so always, Jesus has a path back to him. That's the
Yeah.
beauty of the prodigal son, is
Yeah.
that the father is standing there, he's looking, he's waiting, and at some point he's running to his son returning.
Hmm.
That's the opportunity that we are invited into, is to watch, wait, hope, pray, and run when they do return.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one thing that I part of the reason I love the work that we do is because we're working with folks that do run to those folks.
Yeah.
When they see them coming back, we know you guys are running to them. It's a beautiful thing. So one of the, I guess another question that maybe that I have,
For sure.
when we, and I say we,
Mhm.
when these centers and their client advocates or their staff
Yeah.
walk into a room with a patient client, is Gen Z any more or less apt to read a preconceived notion about them off of that staff member coming in?
Wow, that's a great question. So naturally, what I would think, I would begin with, how did Gen Z find that PRC?
Okay.
So my guess is they Googled it, and that's a pretty common attribute with Gen Z, and with the rest. We have grown into that as well, but it's a very natural response for Gen Z to Google something, do research, find information, things like that. So they're most likely walking in with something they've read from the website or something like that. So their minds are probably even, apart from the shock of being in the situation that they're in, their minds are geared to ask, like, okay, is all of this on brand? Is what I read in the website and seeing the pictures, is it on brand? Is it authentic to itself?
Okay.
So that's probably, a question that is bouncing around in their minds as they're in the waiting room. Again, there's the questions of safety, and, they've probably also Googled, organizations like Planned Parenthood or, like that, where, they have another set of information that they are that they are working through. So, so that would be what immediately comes to mind is like, is this place authentic to what I've read on the website? I think on top of it is the question, am I safe? Years ago now. In 2013, Slate ran an article that said that birth was the sixth most dangerous or the sixth biggest cause of death among women. So they made birthing dangerous.
Yeah.
And I came across that article and I found it really curious. I was like, okay, sixth most lethal, or cause of death to women. It's like, wow, that's really a misleading statistic. So years and years ago, I think it was in the 30s or 40s, there was a book published called How to Lie with Statistics. Mm-hmm. And the real crux behind it was, how can you deceive people with the data or just the plain facts of the data? And so I said, I've got to know how many women who give birth die a year in America. In 2019, I think out of 3,700,000 births, 745 women died giving birth through some complication or something like that. Mm-hmm. Now, when I say it like that, doesn't mean that we have any less compassion or concern or anything like that. There's 754, I think I said 745, 754 women passed away while giving birth. But in light of 3.7 million, that sixth leading cause of death suddenly becomes, much smaller. So, I mean, it's even going back to, things like that, like having those conversations saying, well, what have you heard? What are you afraid of? Like, what, this is a scary situation. Nobody needs to sugarcoat it. Like, nobody plans on getting pregnant. Mm-hmm. So, like, what is it that you've heard? What are questions that you have? And maybe they have some questions like, well, hey, here's some other common questions that we get. Can we walk through these common questions with you? And if you want to ask other people these questions, and if they have different answers and you got questions about these different answers,
So it actually seems like no matter how we go about this, we're saying something very similar, which is that certainly we want, like, I've made this comment before that oftentimes we point as Christians to faith a lot. Sure. I just have faith. I have faith. God's going to do it. If God's going to pull through, I have faith.
For sure.
And we forget
the human component.
But we forget that there's a whole genre of literature in the Bible called wisdom literature.
Sure.
And Proverbs is written, we talk a lot about being prepared in this thing. So, yes, we want to be prepared walking into these rooms.
Sure.
But again, we are not in control of the decision that that person makes.
No, not at all. I think the other thing that I would say, one thing that I came across while working on the dissertation was the workplace environment. Mm-hmm. So having a very detailed strategy for how Gen Z can perform well in the workplace and when does promotion happen. So millennials, we always had the joke about millennials, which I must say is the best generation because I am a millennial, but
nobody's perfect.
So millennials, we just expected to be running the place within a few days, a few weeks when we walked into our first job. And we were very confused why we weren't president after a week or two. With Gen Z, I don't think they have too many idealistic ideas around when will I be running the company, but they do want to know, what does it take to get promoted? So what should I be doing and what is a reasonable timeline? I think something that is possible with the vulnerable in this situation is to have a reasonable expectation of what's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
What are the joys that you will experience and what are the difficulties we're pretty darn sure you're going to experience? Sure. And then couple that plan, maybe it's something you write out for 2 or 3 years and say, well, on top of it, we've got these tribe of mentors that when these things happen, you're going to have dinner with them, every Friday night or, at least with one of them.
Yeah. Creating community.
And you get to ask the question of, hey, they told me this difficult thing would happen. It happened. What should I do now?
Yeah.
And then, you've got people who are feeding into the conversation. But I think that goes back to the authenticity.
Yeah.
I was having coffee with somebody and I was like, listen, this was about 2 months ago. I said, listen, like this is not true that there are no resources available to the vulnerable once they have the child.
Yeah.
That's a great myth that has been created in America for obvious reasons. And they wanted to argue with me on it. And I was like, so it was what my walkaway was, wow, you believe the myth that there aren't a lot of resource centers out there who are able, to help and aid and things like that.
And mentor and do all those things for sometimes years. Yeah.
And nobody's saying anybody's doing it perfectly because, we're all imperfect people. But I think, addressing those myths as well. What are the reasonable expectations going forward for the next 2 or 3 years?
Yeah. That's good. I think Megan says we got some questions now. So
We have maybe 5 or 6.
Sweet.
Okay, so the first one is, I see a disconnect between an up-and-coming pro-life generation that understands that abortion isn't all that pro-abortionists have promised.
Okay.
So a disconnect between that and their response when they're actually faced with the reality of an unintended pregnancy.
Okay. So there's a disconnect between abortion is not, it doesn't fulfill the promise.
Sure.
But can you repeat the last half?
So a disconnect between that and their response when they're actually faced with the reality of
Okay. So maybe abortion doesn't fulfill what's promised, but I'm not necessarily going to make a choice for life when I'm faced with an unintended pregnancy.
Is because I think I'm hearing that question, but I'm also hearing another question that there's a pro-life generation that values pro-life, but really does nothing to support pro-life endeavor. So if somebody who's vulnerable comes to them, kind of like, well, it's your decision. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's the heart of it, but also in the sense of a little bit of what Jason was saying is maybe an up and coming pro-life generation that maybe is personally pro-life, but a difference in that if they themselves were also to be facing an unintended pregnancy or their friends or, something.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we all have values and then the rubber hits the road.
Right.
So, we have to live and choose and make those decisions inside of it. I guess my question is, what type of answer is the question hoping for? I'm not clear on that. So I agree in premise, but I'm not clear.
I think so. The last part of the question was just thoughts question.
Oh, thoughts. Okay.
And then she clarified that there's a discrepancy between rhetoric and reality.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, so a conversation you and I had a couple of months ago about millennials and Gen Z. Millennials will hold a value, and Gen Z usually holds that value just a little bit more. And one of the values that has come out is basically live and let live. I'm not going to make a decision. I'm not going to force you into a decision or an uncomfortable decision or anything like that. Like, you have to make your own choices. And on its face, it's probably true on its face. I think that with issues like this, it goes back to what we've really been dialoguing about for the last 20 minutes of if you put the right tools in people's hands to understand what the truth is around what life will be like, I think people feel more confident addressing that with themselves and with their friends when it comes up. But if they feel like they don't have information, they're probably going to lean out of their values in that instance.
Do you think that growing up more slowly and that emotional intelligence thing, it plays into this a little bit?
Wow. Okay.
So, for instance, my 14-year-old has no problem telling my 11-year-old what she should be doing. But if I tell my 14-year-old what she should be doing, now there's a problem. So,
yeah. Well, and that's part of the human condition. So, I mean, studies show that when parents take their kids to McDonald's, that parents buy the lower calorie, healthier Happy Meal options. So apple slices instead of French fries, things like that. And mom or dad buys the French fries and the Big Mac and the giant soda and everything. So we often have a disconnect with ourselves when it comes to our reality. Like we do a better job of taking care of other people than we do our own selves. So
yeah.
So I think there's a lot of factors in that.
Yeah. So I think, I feel like in some ways the answer is, or the maybe not the answer, but what kind of we're discussing is that, again, let's do everything that's in our power to do.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, trust that God has it in his hands if they walk out and make a decision that even seems consistent with what they would say to their friends. Right. I think one of the things that I have worked very hard on with myself, especially very recently, is what is God calling Jason to be faithful to right now?
Yes.
That's it. I can't be faithful to what he's calling you or Megan or anybody else to do. So
if you could, that'd be great. If you could take care of my stuff.
If I can just be faithful to what God's calling. So in that moment, if I can be faithful to what God's calling me to do with this woman right now, and trust that when she leaves, somebody else is going to be faithful to what God's called them to do for her.
Paul planted, Apollos watered.
Yeah.
The Lord got the increase.
Yeah. So what else we got, Megan?
Okay. Next is, what would you suggest our social media should be focusing on? Safety, decreasing anxiety. What kinds of messaging would you suggest?
That's a great question. So the question, just to make sure everybody hears it well, is where should we be directing our social media focus? Easing anxiety. What was the other thing? Safety. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. My fiance is in marketing, and she has a couple of good points. You should not run a social media platform that you yourself do not use regularly. So, if you're a PRC and you're like, well, we should really get into this TikTok, you should probably find somebody who's passionate about pro-life, who's in that demographic of TikTok user to use TikTok.
Sure.
So I kind of want to lead with that because I've just seen so many people say, well, we've got to get into this sphere. I was like, you don't get it. Like, you don't get, like, I don't do anything on TikTok. One, because I don't understand. I'm a jerk. I don't understand why I need to see people doing the same dance 1,000 times. And it's all the same dance. Like, it doesn't matter which TikTok it is. It's all the same dance.
Different person, same
just
dance.
A different person. So the clothes thing where like people put on different clothes and it looks like they're like exploding into their new clothes. That I kind of dig that, but seems interesting to me. But if it's not the platform that you regularly use, I really recommend find somebody who's.
And what I love about that is that backs up what our marketing people are telling all of you, which is you need a marketing person before you really launch into big, heavy social media campaigns. But
on top of it, I have been trained this way, and I'm confident Gen Z is this way, is that you're probably not going to go just to the website. You're going to go to whatever that social media account is that speaks to you, and you're going to kind of troll through there and see what the messaging is. So you want to make sure that your messaging is consistent because it's part of your brand as a PRC. So you got to make sure that the promises that you make and keep are communicated on your platform. With mental health and safety, I think you should use that language because it is a driving force in the generation now. And nobody said this, but I think it's important to say you don't get to make connections where there aren't connections.
Yeah.
So you don't get to, you really need to do your work when you're talking about anxiety and things like that, because Gen Z, they're in it. So they are going to, they're going to see those things readily that are disconnected with that information. But yeah, I would totally do it. I think that just as we were talking about the Slate article from 2013, I'm like, wait a second, these statistics seem misleading. And to me, they are misleading.
Yeah.
When I read them, like, you probably want to plug into information like that, saying, here's the truth about this issue. Let's, create a conversation around it. So that's kind of where I would hang out.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered the question. That's where I'd hang
Well,
out.
I think in some ways you did. When you think about, I have younger sisters who are not pro-life
Sure.
at all. And one of them, when they're parroting some pro-choice arguments, it's safe abortion.
Yes.
And that's a pro-choice argument. Now we all know what is safe when a human being dies. Just going to ask that question, but
and what makes what makes the whole process safe?
Right.
I mean,
so that's one way where actually we all have a leg up because actually what we're offering is way more safe.
sure.
We know and recognize that we're being lied to on the other side of the argument. Sure. So, other questions, Megan?
So speak to this a little bit more, Aaron. It says Aaron was on a roll with Gen Z things that they want: healthcare, good salary, mentorship in the workplace.
Yeah.
Is there anything else on this list that you can speak to?
So other things on the list that Gen Z wants besides.
Yeah. So two things come to mind, and thank God they come to mind because I was like, wait, I was thinking about the workplace. So again, kind of with the workplace, Gen Z isn't as concerned about work-life balance as you and I are. So
again, nobody's perfect.
They just don't know. Because again, they carry that Gen Xer value over of you're going to have to work hard. You got to scrap. You got to do it for yourself. And they want to do well. They want to be successful. So I think they're in a stage where they are like, I'm willing to do that. And work life doesn't seem like an issue to me. So that is one thing, work-life balance. And the other thing is just stability. So as of 2017, 2019, it feels like a lifetime ago, but what started trending with college entry was that Gen Zers were trending towards jobs like nursing or accounting or joining the military. That's not college, but it can be a path to college. Yeah. And really, the trades are something that really needs to be emphasized with the Gen Z generation. Man, the prices I pay my plumber, and I'm like, I've got a doctorate. Oh my God. So stability, and again, it kind of goes back to that safety question, but stability is a big part of that as well. So one thing that just real quick, so Netflix had done a great job of pioneering temporary work. So this is more with the coding realm and everything, but millennials loved being on a job for 6 to 8 months, getting paid out, and basically being temporary employees for Netflix. They also loved being able to work from wherever they wanted to work, things like that. I love those things. And then I actually got a little nervous, like as I was coming across Gen Z's, like, oh no, I don't want, these temporary gigs. I want, solid 30-year employment. This and I was like, whoa. I need you guys to slow down. I don't need you ruining anything for me. It took me years to get here.
Yeah.
So I would say those are some of the other things. I would just add one more thing, that Gen Z is kind of in its half-life right now. So every generation is bifurcated, or it is cut in two. So you end up with a first wave and a second wave. So I'm a first wave millennial. I'm 38, and I was born in 83. Some would say I'm the first millennial. Some may roll that back to 1981, 1980. Someone listening may have just heard 1980 and died inside out of fearing that they are a millennial. Don't worry about that. You're part of the best generation ever. And so, but the point that I really want to make, all jokes aside, is that when you cut these generations in half, the first wave typically behaves a little differently compared to the second wave. Second wave is going to have some different characteristics. So second wave millennials tend to have more Gen Z-ish qualities, and first wave Gen Zers tend to have a few of those millennial qualities as well. So with that said, Gen Z first wave use of drugs, alcohol, sex outside of marriage, those numbers were way down for that segment of the generation. They've gone to college, they're going to college, they graduated college. So we're kind of on a precipice of seeing what are the behaviors going to change at all. And when we get to the end, there's actually something I would like to wrap up with about that. But so we're kind of in the middle of this. What's going to change?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I like the stability thing, because you think about even these continuing conversations, like the idea of a long-term relationship, like that's stability.
That's stability.
So that's an interesting thing for sure. All right, Megan.
Okay. So this is maybe a little bit of a brainstorming question among the executive directors who are tossing some ideas around.
Okay.
I would also love to get your thoughts on it briefly.
Do we have a whiteboard? We can't brainstorm without a whiteboard.
You're right.
Okay, so next question.
Next time we'll have the whiteboard. But
so since they're so mobile addicted, do you feel it would be helpful to text them something like a white paper or something that they could download to their phone of a list of questions to ask an abortion provider?
Oh, yes.
These are smart people.
Yes, these are smart people. Yes, I mean, I think something that we have to grapple with technology is that eventually it overtakes a whole cohort. Yeah. Or a whole, 80-year span. So I always make the joke when like Gen Xers or baby boomers are like, man, my kid's face is just always in their phone. I'm like, are you serious? Your face is always in your phone. Like, nobody's fooling me. I've been trying to get your attention for 3 minutes.
Well, I love the comment specifically about Gen Z. They're so selfish. I'm like, so are we.
We
just are selfish about different things. Yeah. But sorry.
But no, I think that I think looking at the marketing trends of how Gen Z consumes products, you just want to co-opt that. You want to borrow that. You want to utilize it. And that's where I've been excited about some of the things that you shared with me about Storks as they're looking to the future. I'm like, yes, like if we do these things, and I just kind of want to tack on with that, years ago, before, probably early 2000s, mid 2000s, there was a lot of talk about how do we evangelize. And it was, well, we have to do it face to face. We have to go door to door, things like that. Well, the reality is that That has all changed.
Mhm.
And everybody goes to the internet.
Mhm.
Everybody goes to something web-based or app-based to find information, even about the gospel now.
Yeah.
So I think that the more that we co-op these ideas of, okay, well, we're going to send a text message, we're going to give them the opportunity to opt out because that's honest.
Mhm.
Just reply stop if you don't want this anymore, and then just retarget the mess out of them. But yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's interesting, or something maybe for us to keep in mind too, about
Sure.
the idea of co-opting some of these things is that, like, I think it's real
Yeah,
that discipleship does not happen on a screen.
Yeah.
But if you start there and use that as a vehicle
Yeah.
to pull your way into some more real personal contact,
yeah,
that looks different, right? We're
Right.
called to look different. And we could start, like you were talking about with Paul, we can start on
Yeah.
this one level and then pull out of that and make it so that
Yeah.
they can see the difference in the positivity.
yeah.
What other questions do we have, Megan?
So we have 3 or 4 more views on that. Great.
Okay.
So the first is, I love the idea of walking alongside with women and their boyfriends in this vulnerable and critical time. Do you have any more to say about that?
I don't. There's plenty of organizations. I mean, Storks can speak into that much better than I can. I haven't walked through like that type of situation, so I don't want to speak to something that I don't.
I think one of the things that we know, for instance, the Life Networks and Colorado Springs Pregnancy Centers here in Colorado Springs has programs like that.
Yep.
And they're very successful.
Yep.
And they, like, our church just kind of highlighted them this past weekend.
That's awesome.
And they were saying that's what they need is more mentors. So I think, yes, it's something that we should try to figure out how to do. Let me put my consultant hat on for a moment and say, if that's something that you guys want to do, let's talk about it and see how that fits in strategically. Because what we don't want to do necessarily is create things that take us off of course. But if we can build and make things better and solidify and create those things, I never want to let the limits that we have as humans get in the way of what the Spirit can do.
Absolutely.
So I'd love to talk more with anybody about that.
Okay, I would really love to have some directions with questions on how to run a successful Gen Z focus group to figure out ideal messaging with our local community of women.
Yeah. So how do we get a hold of those people, get them involved, and get them on board with helping us with our pro-life message?
Yeah. Wow. That's a great question. So here's what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't go get all the church kid Gen Zers.
Yeah.
I wouldn't make them the predominant members of your focus group. There's something that we in the academic world and statistically we talk about our populations and our sample sizes. And I don't need to super get into that. But what you do want is to reach out to some Gen Zers who are not Christian, who are even pro-abortion, or at least think that they are, and say, hey, we're doing this focus group and we're going to ask a series of questions, and it would be really great if you would come and be a part of it. Another thing that you can do is meet one-on-one with these. So sometimes doing a group may not be in your best interest. Maybe you want to start out with a few conversations one-on-one and collect information from that. It's something that we call a phenomenological study. But you're getting their experience around these topics and ideas. And I'd be happy to work with Storks or, whoever to
I would love to talk about that.
And things like that.
We have seen a lot of success with focus groups.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I have suggested is that maybe find a Students for Life group on campus,
Sure.
not to necessarily be your focus group, but to help you find your focus group.
Yes. Yeah. At the end of the day, ideally, if you're doing something like that, you want to talk to about 30 individuals to really get like a good sample size. So yeah, I would take your time with it. Don't be in a rush with it, but definitely like develop questions, things like that. And you're going to learn. And the reason I like to start with one, like maybe 5 people and having those one-on-ones is all of a sudden you're discovering questions and even how to ask the questions.
Yeah.
So it's a little clunky at first. You feel clunky. You're like, why did I write this question this way? And so,
yeah, no, and I hadn't thought about it that way. I appreciate that thought that starting small isn't a bad thing.
No, not
because
at
it
all.
can help you develop the right way to go about it for
It
the
can
larger
help you
groups.
develop quality questions.
Yeah, that's great.
So yeah.
Cool. What else?
All right, one more.
Okay.
So thinking progressively about marketing and catchy phrases to either use or to stay away from when trying to appeal to Gen Z. Examples of "we are your tribe for support," "your safe tribe." So using that word tribe, does that word or the word tribal, is that okay to use with Gen Z?
No.
People in general are very tribal minded.
Sure.
But could this be a negative term to speak with Gen Zers? I'm assuming in the way of like maybe political correctness.
Sure. I wouldn't use the word tribal. I mean, that's my word trying to communicate an idea. Again, that's a great question for focus groups, things like that. I also would say we want to be really careful about trying to use Gen Z catchphrases because often they will simply just come across as inauthentic. And the most important thing you can do is be authentic in what you're presenting. So, something like ye life, pro-life is great. That's not really where you want to, kind of hang out with these phrases. Again, get somebody that's age appropriate with these platforms to use lingo or slang or something like that. But I think it's more important to just be authentic than to worry about some buzzwords.
Do you think that there's a positive thing to obviously being mindful? I thought about a Instagram reel. I don't look at TikTok that I will not repeat what is on there, but it is hysterical. And it's like an old man saying something about Jesus, thinking that this is a great thing.
Okay.
And it's like, it's ridiculous and offensive.
Okay.
But so you don't want to go that route, right? But what you do want, I think, based off of what I've heard you say is, don't assume that because you're older, they don't want to pay attention to you.
Exactly.
So you may have something authentic to offer.
Right.
That is age appropriate to you.
Yeah.
And they would be willing to listen.
Yeah. I mean, be authentic. Like periodically I speak to our middle school, senior high kids at New Life Midtown. And the last thing that I ever want to do is walk in and try and be hip and cool. Because I mean, as much as I'm in the Gen Z sphere, I can't be hip and cool with Gen Z stuff. I mean, look at me. So I walk in and I am authentically who I am and ask them questions. Say, well, what do you think about this? Somebody tell me about this. And I make fun of them and belittle them and they love it. It's just great. So yeah, that's where I would land. Again, having a good marketing person who can say, this is where we need to be is probably the best medicine.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I know you said you had one final thing that you wanted to kind of wrap up with, and I would love to pray for us before we finish. So I'll let you go and then.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So one thing that I want to bring into our purview is that generations do not stay the same. Generations actually grow and mature and change in some ways. So with Gen Z, they grow up in this kind of adolescence, overprotected snowplow parent They go into their adulthood trying to play it safe and safe job stability, things like that. But when they will arrive at their midlife stage, so early 40s, mid 40s, something like that, they're going to say, wow, this safety hasn't been working for me. And I really feel like I've been missing out on life.
Yeah.
And so that will also be another opportunity to disciple a generation. And we have to keep in mind that wherever a generation finds themselves in what's called an age location, whatever their age location is that God has a plan for them. And he is working through that maturation process to change things. So when we talk about mental health being an obstacle with Gen Z, it may not always be an obstacle. It may be something that by midlife, I'm like, wow, I think I've got a handle on it in a different way that I didn't before. So there is always hope, and we get to be actors on a stage participating in this grand story around generations.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to pray real quick and then we'll officially wrap up. How's that? Okay. All right. Father God, I thank you so much for this blessed and ordained time that we got to chat, create conversation around a really wonderful group of people that is wonderful people can be difficult to deal with. And so we thank you that Gen Z exists, that they stretch and challenge us. And I just pray that this is meaningful and beneficial to those who will have an opportunity to watch it. I just thank you, God, for being a God of diversity. And man, there's just not a human on the planet that was not made in your image. And that includes Gen Z. And we just are so grateful for that. I thank you for Dr. Brown and everything that he brought tonight. I thank you for these folks that were on this call, for their willingness to stick with us through some technical challenges. And just thank you, God, for being an awesome God. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen. All right. Well, thank you all very much for being a part of this. I'm very grateful. Aaron, I appreciate you being here.
It's a blast.
Megan, thank you so much for manning the computer. Thank you for sticking with us through the technical issues. We'll probably send something out. If it was terrible, blame it all on me. If it was great, give all the glory to God. I'm cool with that. That's it. Thank you all. Have a great night.